Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS Webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry and other sciences, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I will be your host for today's broadcast, which we are proudly co-producing with the Science History Institute and Chemical and Engineering News. As the interest in alternative meats is increasing, several startups have established companies that are developing and commercializing alternatives to animal-based meat. Today, we are joined by 4 experts in industry as they discuss how this transformation will affect the future of food consumption and talk a little bit about the regulatory, economic, and consumer perception hurdles that it faces. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Lisa A. Grissom, who is the Senior Philanthropy Advisor at the Science History Institute, to tell us about today's speakers and moderator.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome to the Science History Institute in Philadelphia and to our Joseph Priestley Society program series. We are delighted to be co-producing with the ACS webinars. It's my pleasure to introduce our program leaders for today. Our moderator will be Chris Gregson, founder of Greenstock Food Consulting, LLC. Chris is a food material scientist with a culinary background. He has founded 2 companies, Greenstock, a food consultancy helping companies to commercialize products through the application of materials science and ingredients technology, and Paragon Pure, a company he co-founded to commercialize technologies enabling encapsulation of natural flavors and nutraceuticals using consumer-preferred carriers. He did his postdoctoral research at Rutgers University, working on food systems for long-term space missions. Chris holds a PhD in rheology from the University of Nottingham. Our panelists are Andrew Ive, founder, Big Idea Ventures, a company whose purpose is to solve the world's biggest challenges by supporting the world's best entrepreneurs, and it is based in New York and Singapore. Big Idea Ventures has special focuses on areas that impact climate change, animal welfare, and personal health, as well as reducing carbon dioxide, plastics, waste, and water in the food industry. Andrew is a Friedman School entrepreneurship advisor and a graduate of Harvard Business School with Procter & Gamble brand management training. Julie Mann is the Chief Innovative Officer at Purus Holdings, LLC. Julie manages the innovative process and develops and executes new technologies and finished food and beverage products. She's also responsible for identifying new business opportunities and innovation strategies. Julie holds 5 U.S. patents with 1 additional patent pending approval. In addition, she's the founding member of Protein 2040, an initiative to feed the growing world population with sufficient protein by 2040. Julie has a master's degree in food science and nutrition from Drexel University. Joshua March is the co-founder and CEO of Artemis Foods, a company whose mission is to empower humanity to eat sustainably. The San Francisco-based firm is working on the next generation of meat alternatives that combine plant-based and cultivated meat. Josh is the author of Message Me, a book about the future of customer service in the era of social messaging and artificial intelligence. He's been featured on Bloomberg, CNBC, the BBC, and other news outlets. Now to begin our program, I present Christopher Gregson.
Hi, welcome to our panel discussion, Neither Fish Nor Fowl. In this panel, we're going to discuss the world of alternative protein foods. So a good place to start this discussion, I think, is to define what we really mean by alternative protein foods. One definition is foods that aim to be equivalent in some way to animal products, either nutritionally, functionally, or mimicking the entire eating experience. Much of the recent emphasis has been on creating better mimics for animal-based foods, whether this is plant-based meats, meat-like plants, or cultured meat, which is real animal meat grown without the animal. So plant-based foods have become a rapidly growing global trend, and this chart shows growing numbers of products launched annually with a vegan claim. Although the size of the market is fairly small, the growth rate is huge. The biggest success is in plant-based milks, which now account for an astonishing 14% of total US milk sales. So overwhelmingly, surveys show that the top consumer drivers are related to health. But there are also other major global drivers which are starting to get governments and non-governmental organizations on board, including the need to feed an ever-growing population, agriculture's influence on habitat loss and climate change, the existential threat from antibiotic resistance, and the growing recognition that animals experience pain and emotion in a manner not too different from ourselves. But most people like eating meat. To get people to shift towards a more plant-centric diet, it's clearly going to take more than asking people to eat tofu. We need to create products that offer the great taste, the cost-effectiveness and convenience of regular meat products. Our panelists represent a spectrum of the people working on the front lines of this goal, and I feel so fortunate to share this virtual stage with these people I admire so much, Andrew Ive, Julie Mann, and Joshua March. So to kick off this discussion, I'd first like to ask each of the panelists to describe what you do and what led you to pursue this career in alternative proteins. So in other words, what's your personal origin story? And I'd like to go to Josh first.
Cool, thanks, Chris, and hi everyone. Josh March, co-founder and CEO of Artemis Foods. So at Artemis, as in the intro, we're working on what we consider to really be the next generation of meat alternatives that combine both plant-based ingredients and cultured meat, both muscle and fat, to bring in the proteins and the fats that actually create that flavor and experience of real meat. I actually first came across the concept of growing meat outside the animal, reading an Ian Banks sci-fi novel in my early 20s, way more than a decade ago. And when I just read this, it just immediately struck me. And I was like, wow, if we can make this a reality, right? If we can get meat onto the technology cycle, where every year we're able to increase the efficiency of production and decrease the cost, then that's something that could really change the world, right? On all kinds of vectors, but especially sustainability. And it just became this obsession of mine. And I was busy running a software company that I'd founded that I ended up doing for the next decade. But I stayed very involved along the way, and always saw like cultured meat as like the ultimate solution for meat alternatives for various reasons, which we'll get into later. And about 5-6 years ago, started to come across some of the first scientists working on that, and I became involved as a donor, an investor, an advisor, and just started to, but while I was very excited by all the research and the technology that was happening, started to see that there were some really big challenges, specifically around cost and scale, that I didn't think companies were addressing in the right way. And I founded Artemis basically to try and solve that and make sure that cultured meat is a reality in the near future.
That's fantastic. So we'll be hearing more about that in a little while. So Andrew, what's your origin story?
So hi everyone, my name's Andrew Ive, and I'm the founder of Big Idea Ventures. As they mentioned at the beginning, that's focusing on solving the world's greatest challenges by backing the world's best entrepreneurs, scientists, and engineers. So the origin story of me personally, I started my career at Procter & Gamble and became an entrepreneur in my dorm room at Harvard Business School. And the next 20 years was very much about starting businesses, joining very young teams to start new companies across 7 different industries. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was asked to take over responsibility for the world's first food tech accelerator based in New York. And what a food tech accelerator is a company that finds very young businesses, gives them a small amount of money, and then helps them full time, along with a group of amazing mentors, to kind of help those companies. Julie Mann was actually part of that, I think, as one of the mentors. That was entirely food centric as an investment opportunity. I got to the point where we were getting about 1,000 deals a year, and really started to see patterns of transformation across the food industry. And the one area that I thought was literally transformative in terms of our species, our culture, and just in terms of food production availability for our species moving forward was around alternative protein. So specifically plant-based, fermentation-based, and cell-based meat, seafood, and dairy. I got completely enamored with that category, believing that it was transformative for us, and ultimately decided to dedicate and to spin myself out of that fund and create a new fund and a new company, which was focused on alternative proteins. So we've invested in about 43 companies so far across the plant-based, cell-based, fermentation-based space globally around the world. We've got offices now in Singapore and New York. And we think we're pretty much at the cutting edge of everything that's changing and growing and evolving in the alternative protein space. So that's the kind of origin story of me and where I arrived at this wonderful panel today.
That's fantastic. Julie.
Thank you, Chris. So my name is Julie Mann, and I am the Chief Innovation Officer for Purus Holdings. Many of you probably know Purus as a bit of a plant-based ingredient company, but Purus is really a closed loop, end-to-end supply chain, all the way from seed genetics of soybean and pulses and other plant-based materials, all the way through to ingredient production, and now even helping and assisting in the development of finished foods like we're going to be talking about today. So my background is in food science, and I'm a very passionate food scientist, have been for 25 years now. I decided at some point that I had always had sort of a guttural feeling around farm animals and the animal supply chain. And for a long time, I was told to sort of put that away because it doesn't really fit in the food science world. You really should be open to all ingredients that are out there for us. And I became a vegetarian and subsequently a vegan. And interestingly enough, I found the perfect intersection of bringing those two things together. So my passion really as a child, driving this space and then coming into food science and being able to promote and really make plant-based ingredients or alternative ingredients that can help us to get away from some of the reliance on the animal supply chain. So for me, ending up in this space makes me smile from ear to ear, because I found a way to pull in both my education and the things that I've really pioneered forward with the passion and the feelings I've had through my life. So working on ingredients today with Purus, and also bringing excellent alternative dairy, alternative meats, basically any alternatives that we're trying to mimic away from the animal products. So that's really my story of how I arrived on this panel today.
My next question goes to Andrew. So animal-free replacement foods have been around for decades. What do you think has happened over the past few years that's led to this explosion in demand for these products?
Fantastic question. So I mentioned before, I kind of started my career at Procter & Gamble. So everything for me starts and ends with the consumer. None of this demand, this transformation that we are literally, it's a tsunami of change in the food industry, wouldn't be happening if the consumers weren't firmly behind it, and actually driving the changes that are happening. But in terms of why that demand is happening, I think there are a few things. One is that from a technology and an entrepreneurial perspective, we've got a lot more creative. So what I mean by that is a lot more entrepreneurs and innovators and creative folks have got involved in what's happening in this space. And so whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, plant-based basically meant blocks of kind of shrink-wrapped tofu in the dusty corner of the supermarket where only the vegans went to, people have started innovating and creating really amazing products with great taste, great texture, almost identical to the products that they are replacing. So it's now possible through that innovation to bring these amazing products to consumers. On top of that, you've got great companies like Purus, for example, that are unlocking the commodity side of the equation. In other words, the ingredients that are out there that have been used in very traditional ways, companies like Purus and like Bühler and Givaudan and companies like that have been able to take these sort of commodities and do amazing things with them, which in the hands of these entrepreneurs and these scientists and engineers and business people have created products that are, from a taste, texture perspective, pretty close to identical. So, I think it's an unlocking of creativity, it's entrepreneurialism, it's great companies aligning with those entrepreneurs to both find the right ingredients, but also to scale production. It's this creativity more than anything else that I think is driving that demand. If you require consumers to think and need to be educated before they purchase, we will have failed in this kind of plant-based, cell-based category. But if we can produce products which are identical to the cultural norms from a food perspective that we've grown up loving as individuals, as families, then we can win. We can win by producing these plant-based and cell-based alternatives.
Clearly, something is going right to lead to the great demand. So, Julie, Andrew touched on the technological advances. I'm wondering what you feel the key technologies have been that have enabled the current alternative protein trend.
I would say there's a host of technologies that are starting to enable this. I think some of them are really focused in clean processing and clean label development of ingredients from crop in through a protein that you would buy as a manufacturer. And I think a lot of that has been driven by consumer demand. Consumers are demanding transparency, clarity of label. They want to be able to pronounce everything. They want to understand what goes into their food, what their food has touched, how nutritious it is, were chemicals used. And so that put kind of a big spotlight on the ingredient industry to say, we need to be doing everything possible to make the cleanest ingredients. So there's a lot of technologies that go into that. And I would say, additionally, there tends to be criticism that comes around processing and, meat alternatives being so over-processed. And at the end of the day, food processing is here for safe food and nutritious food. And all of the things that we eat are processed. So I think most of the technologies we're leveraging today are food processing technologies. And I think people can start to embrace that food technology and food processing is a positive thing. So specifically, some of those would be technologies like lowering sodium in some of the protein ingredients. That's something that gets discussed a lot in meat alternatives. And, I could go on and on with various attributes I know we'll probably get into as we talk through today.
We've made amazing gains in this industry. Josh, I'm wondering if you could comment on what you think the biggest gaps are in the industry left.
If you look at leading kind of plant-based burgers on the market today, right, they're significantly ahead of the previous generation of veggie burgers, right? They're way better, but they're still not like a great burger compared to an actual great beef burger, right? And there's quite a few gaps, and these are similar gaps as you see in other type of meat alternative products as well, right? Texture is a big one, especially the kind of juiciness that you get from animal fat, right? Combined with like the strong flavor properties in that fat is something that's very hard to fully replicate with plant-based and fats and oils. They just don't kind of act in quite the same way. Taste is a big one. It's been getting a lot better, but taste and aroma kind of go hand in hand, right? A lot of the proteins used in meat alternatives still have kind of an off flavor or kind of planty or kind of vegetable flavor, either taste or smell, that just like isn't the same as real meat. And so that's something that really needs solving. And the taste is kind of like, taste has got better, but it's still not like there. It's getting meatier, but it's still not like the taste of a great burger. And on appearance, Impossible obviously really look great because of their heme protein, right? So they accurately reflect the kind of color of raw meat and how that changes as it cooks. But they've wrapped up a lot of the IP on that, and it's pretty unique. And most of the other products, especially like beef products, don't really look very good. Right? It's very hard to replicate that color change that you see in raw meat using purely plant-based ingredients. So there's still a long way to go, basically.
So there are some great products on the market today. So Andrew, I wonder if you would comment on why you think that people still continue to eat animal products. Is it that there's too much of a gap between animal-based foods and plant-based foods, or do you think there's aesthetic, cultural factors? What do you think is the reason why people continue to eat animal-based foods?
So there are different things happening in different parts of the world, and we see that at Big Idea Ventures because we're heavily involved in Asia as well as North America and Europe and other places. So we see it being different in different places. Interestingly, some of this comes back to what Josh was just saying in terms of plant-based is still close but not perfect, and there's still room for innovation, improvement. We're relying in the plant-based space specifically on three kind of core crops, so pea, soy, and wheat. I think we need to get more creative with alternative ingredients so that we can actually get closer to hitting that target. But I don't think we're 100% there yet. I think we are getting first movers. I think we're getting vegetarians, vegans, people who care about the climate and sustainability. Thankfully, and I don't know who it is, but somebody deserves a medal. Somebody decided to put Beyond out of the vegan section of the store and put it into the meat category alongside regular meat products, so people could see it, and by people I mean non-vegans, non-vegetarians could see it and pick it up and maybe take it home and try it and like it. That happened. That's why we saw the growth of Beyond and why we're seeing the growth of Impossible, because people are trying it. They're pleasantly surprised by it. My own wife, for example, was never going to let one of these things pass her lips, but now we regularly chow down on plant-based foods. So I think we're getting there. In some places around the world, however, meat is still an aspirational product where a family, for example, in India may be able to afford one meat-based meal, meat protein on a weekly basis, and they would love to have 2 or 3 meals on a weekly basis that includes animal protein. So in certain countries, there's an aspiration for more meat, not less meat. In the US and Europe, we're seeing the growth of plant-based as a kind of a demanded product. We can't actually meet the demand of plant-based foods, meat, seafood, dairy that's coming through in the US and Europe. I'm sure Purus is probably 80% plus in terms of its production capability, because we just can't keep up. That's not the case in other kind of key countries around the world where meat is still a cultural aspiration.
So I'd like to ask Julie to touch on a topic you brought up earlier, and that's clean label. So clean label has been a trend that's been growing steadily for 40 years probably. And at the moment, there is a second trend that's appearing in the food industry, and that's around synthetic biology, cultured proteins, and high-tech science applied to food. I'm wondering what you think the future holds in terms of alternative protein, and where those two trends, because those two trends seem to collide somewhat. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on where you think the future lies in terms of those two elements.
To be honest with you, I think education is going to be the gap that ties this piece all together. First of all, I would say consumers understand clean label because they've heard a lot about it. It's like you said, it's been 30, 40 years of trend here. I think education is the piece that always seems to be missing when we get into these new technology spaces. So understanding that, fermentation and some of the processes by which cells come to life and cells are kind of replicated in order to produce foods it's been going on for hundreds of years. And people just don't understand all of the intricacies around growing cells or around bringing a fermented product that has live and active cultures within it. So, I mean, I think where we are right now is that there are some folks who are a little bit hesitant because they don't understand what cell culturing is, and they don't understand how these cells are fed. They don't understand how they're generated, how they're multiplied into a way that you could produce a steak or a piece of chicken or a piece of meat. I think, to me, it's going to be one of the solves. We're going to need all of the options on the table. We're going to need plant options. We're going to need fermented mycelial options. We're going to need cell culture options, and we're going to need all of them in order to actually meet the demand of replacing animals in the supply chain. So I guess the best way to answer your question is, I think there's some hesitancy right now. I think the right education needs to be done and will be done, and I think very quickly people will start to understand that these foods bring a great benefit to our food system.
Yeah. So Josh, you're our resident expert on cultured meat. What do you think the consumer response is going to be? And broader than that, what do you think the first products are going to be on the market that represent cultured meat?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there will, of course, be consumers who are scared or hesitant of the technology involved, right? It's this new and kind of novel food. At the same time, we're seeing that there is a really big generational shift taking place, where younger consumers are increasingly comfortable with technology being used in creating food, right? And you can see a pretty straight line when you look at surveys that ask questions around that. The younger the consumer, the more and more comfortable they are, right? And you look at Gen Z today, and they're people who grew up with iPads as a toddler, right? And so the idea that technology isn't being used in anything is kind of weirder than it is being used. So I think there is that big generational shift. And 5 years ago, if you'd said to most people, hey, this company, Impossible Foods, are going to be making this burger, and it's going to be made of GMO soy, and it's going to have this special ingredient that they're genetically engineering yeast to produce that's going to make it look and taste more like meat, and they're going to sell it in Burger King, be completely open and honest, and no one will really care. You would have said, completely crazy, never will happen, right? But that's exactly what they're doing, and most people just are like, cool, it works, right? And I think there's a really big kind of insight from that, which is, if you look at 20 years ago, first kind of GMO crops coming out, right? And the benefit was all around profit, right? It was a pitch to farmers and companies saying you can make more money, and it was very secretive. There was very little information shared with consumers, right? And people were scared, understandably. And I think what you're seeing with companies today is they're being open, they're being transparent, they're talking about the science, they're talking about the safety, they're giving the reason for consumers about why it matters to them. And a lot of consumers are saying, okay, great, I'm fine with that. And I think we're going to see something similar with cultured meat, right? As long as it's done in the right way, as long as you talk about the safety and the process, and you're open and you talk about the benefits, there are a lot of consumers who are going to be really comfortable and excited to try it, and that number's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think that's like general kind of thoughts there. There's of course no doubt that there will be people who hate it. In terms of the first products, we can kind of talk more about some of the technology and the technological hurdles, right? But growing animal cells today is extremely expensive. So the first, and there's kind of complexity, which we can get into around like turning those cells into structured meat products. So the first products, and we're already seeing this with Eat Just Chicken in Singapore, it'll be a combination of cultured muscle and fat cells combined with plant-based ingredients to create products that will, to start with, will be like ground meat products, whether that's a chicken nugget or a burger. And using the cells, using the muscle and the fat to bring in all the flavor and the proteins and the fats and the aroma, all the things that the great stuff that people want out of meat. And that'll be the first products. And I think it's going to be a while longer until we start to see products that are 100% cultured or have more complex structures.
Yeah, it's certainly challenging to create that structure of real animal meat. So, Julie, I'd like to ask you, thinking more broadly, what do you see as the most exciting technology on the horizon, and that you think are going to have the biggest impact going forwards?
The biggest technology going forward, I mean, I think there's a host of technologies on the horizon around plant-based, around cell-based, and fermentation. I think a lot of these technologies are really honing in on nutritional completeness. So taking, for example, plant proteins and really making sure that you're delivering all the amino acids for complete protein. And typically that's done through combining proteins at this point. So there's technologies on the horizon, I think, that are really helping in that space. I also think when we're thinking about the gaps again, where are the big gaps in this category? It goes back to texture, mouthfeel, organoleptics, what is going on in the mouth, as well as the structure and the function of the protein to actually create the scaffold or the structure that gives you something that looks and tastes like a piece of meat. So really, I mean, there's technologies emerging in all areas. It's very difficult to pick one that I think is really way ahead of the others. I think at the end of the day, the most important is going to be in the structuring. So basically today in plant-based, we're working really hard to understand how to make proteins behave. Plant proteins have very different functionality subunits. We want them to behave like casein. We want them to behave like whey. We want them to form actin and myosin structures for meat. So there's technologies that are enabling us to look at our current proteins and make better proteins today. So they check the box for that texture and structure, which translates into better mouthfeel and more likability from consumers. And again, that loop has to be closed, because if the consumers aren't happy with what the products that they're seeing from whatever the alternative is, we're not going to be driving growth and sales and kind of leadership in the market.
Yeah, so I want to ask one more question before we go to a short break. Andrew, a lot of investment dollars are going into the alternative protein industry. Do you think this capital is being deployed optimally? And if not, how would you like to see it change? Of course, all the money needs to go to big idea ventures, and
that was the answer, right? Only by us. We're the only ones who are investing it optimally. So the capital is being deployed by different actors for different reasons. So for example, we had Temasek in Singapore, which is a government-based venture capital firm, put 8 figures in our first fund, specifically in alternative protein. And part of the reason why the Singaporean government is involved or interested is they're building a hub or ecosystem around future of food in Singapore for Asia and for their country. They see alternative protein as absolutely critical for their long-term goals of food production and food security. As at this point, 96, I think, % of the food that Singapore consumes as a country is imported. And they got particularly nervous from press and so on and conversations I had during COVID, that their neighbors would stop sending them food and suddenly they would be an entire country without the ability to feed its population. They see plant-based and cell-based, so what Josh is focused on, what Julie's focused on, and what I'm focused on, as absolutely, mission critical for their country moving forward. So they're putting funds in for the from a food security perspective. We've got corporates, food corporates, global food corporates as investors in our fund because they see consumers moving quickly towards plant-based at this point and maybe cell-based eventually. And as food corporates, they want to be on the kind of cutting edge of what's changing in the food industry. So those folks are investing because of wanting to be in touch with, great companies like Josh's and others who are at the kind of pushing the envelope of alternative protein. Then we've got investors who are family offices and animal welfare related people who are investing either for the value creation on the family office side or on the animal welfare side because they want us as a people to be more sustainable for the planet and also be able to produce the protein without harming and causing I don't want to use the torture word, but I just did. Damn it! They want us to invest in companies that will allow us to produce the protein without the emotional and physical side effects to animals. So there are different folks investing in this category for different reasons. One is not more valid than another, but I do think over the next 20 years, plant-based is very much the low-hanging fruit. That's what's happening right now. I personally think that cell-based and cultured meat is, whether we like it or not, the future. And I think it's going to be driven from Asia because Singapore, for example, recently deregulated cell-based technology meat as a food that's available for human consumption. I think China will be next, and we'll see a swing to Asia in terms of cell-based meat production being like the way forward. We can't have the species, the quantity of people on this planet that we will have without these technologies. It's not there's no choice.
All right, so my first question from the audience is, can you discuss the nutritional value of these meat alternatives, including micronutrients and other things that natural meat and fish absorb from their environment?
Sure, I can start and just talk a little bit about the nutritional composition, at least of the current plant-based meats on the market. Typically, there's a lot of attention drawn to the micronutrients or deficiencies in plant-based versus meat, and I think there's a complement to talk about. One is that there are micronutrients that come from the plant-based ingredients, so things like phosphorus, manganese, magnesium, things that come along with the plant protein ingredient that will promote better micronutrient diversity within the alternative. So I think there's a lot of positive things that plants bring. They also bring fiber. So fiber is not something that occurs in beef or in a beef patty. Reduced calories, so reduced caloric intake is also typically a positive advantage of these products. Some of them are being made to match a beef patty exactly, so in that case you wouldn't have a caloric reduction. Also, cholesterol is something that comes from animal sources, not from plant sources. So I would say in general there's kind of this conundrum and comparison all the time of the two. They both bring their values to the nutritional table. I would say, as far as animals picking up contaminants or pesticides or heavy metals or things from their environment, this is something that plant-based fermentation and culture, cell culture, all basically eliminate. So we don't have to worry if a fish has been gulping up mercury at the bottom of the ocean. We don't have to worry if the cattle have gotten into some polluted stream or polluted area, because we're controlling the environment around the things that we're building. So this argument comes up a lot, and I think there's definitely folks who are still kind of hammering down on the processed food side of things and saying that meat alternatives are more processed, but at the end of the day, it's just a formulation of ingredients to mimic the same item.
Yeah, so in a similar vein, Josh, we've got a question. The meat alternatives are more processed than traditional ground beef. Why would I want to eat them?
And again, following on from Julie, right, the word processed, I don't think is that necessarily like fully understood by a lot of people. When I think of the word processed, what it means to me is like purified proteins and starches that have been purified from a cell and then reconstituted in various ways, right? So when people talk about like, is eating like plant-based meat bad for you because it's made of these like purified proteins, my general comment is like, well, it's kind of similar to have a protein shake, right? Is it as healthy for you as eating like a whole food salad? Like probably not. Is it bad for you? Like no. You're eating proteins and fats and starches. It's not that different to a lot of other stuff you're eating all the time. And if you look at the quality of a lot of meat that's consumed in the US, right? When people think of like what is traditional beef, right? They're thinking about a cow grass-fed on a farm somewhere. That's a great image. It accounts for a minuscule percentage of the beef that's eaten in America or in most of the developed world, right? Most of it are animals that are stuck together in intense feeding lots, kind of force-fed on corn, which is an unnatural diet, given huge amounts of antibiotics, right? Is the quality of that meat something you'd want to eat? Like probably not if people actually thought about it, right? So there is this kind of like ideal of like the grass-fed, pasture-raised, like massaged Wagyu cow, and sure, like maybe there's different debates about plant versus meat. That aside, that may be the ideal, but personally, I'd much prefer to have like a plant-based burger than most like fast food burgers that are sold in the US from a health perspective. I think with cell-based meat, you kind of can get the best of all worlds, right? It's a whole food. While it's like processed in the sense that it's created technologically and grown outside the animal, it's still it's the whole cell. It's the same kind of balance of nutrients you get in nature, but it doesn't have any of those challenges that Julie was bringing up around like fish eating mercury or all the kind of waste things, all the other kind of contaminants that can get into an animal. And so I think that has really a lot of.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's an awful lot about perception on behalf of the consumer. And Andrew, I have a question to you on alternative proteins a little bit more broadly. What are your thoughts on insects as alternatives to traditional animal protein sources?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I mentioned I was involved in a different fund previously where we got about 1,000 deals a year in the food space. There was a phase about 5 years ago where everything, well, not everything, but where a significant percentage of the companies we were seeing were insect-based. So different executions, insect growing units that were on Kickstarter that you could buy and grow your own mealworms in your own house and add mealworms as a protein source to your shakes. Using crickets in Exobar, for example, a product that was launched in Whole Foods, and cricket flour and all sorts of other executions. That went away. As a product category, it basically went away. Whole Foods stopped selling products that were insect-based. People just sort of didn't really grab hold of that category. At least in the United States, that's worth mentioning. When I saw people executing on, for example, making cookies using insect or cricket flour, people would try them and they would sort of laugh amongst their friends with the ick factor of having tried something, but it wasn't a repeat purchase. It wasn't something where there was a yum factor where people would say, okay, this is something I want more of and I'm prepared to add it to my daily diet or my weekly shopping list. So in the US, I don't see it taking off anytime soon. There are other cultures, for example, China and in Africa, where insect is actually part of some kind of cultural diets and meals and so on, where there's a lower hurdle in terms of acceptance, but I don't see that hurdle being excuse me, I don't see that hurdle being crossed anytime soon in the US and in Europe, mainly because it's never really been part of our culture, as far as I'm aware. People might say, well, you know, what about when we were, you know, multi-generations before, when we were hunting for grubs and things? But I don't think in our modern culture, insects today, at least in North America, Europe, and other kind of key blocks, are not really having insects as a core ingredient for consumption.
Just saying, I fully agree. Like, wouldn't it be great, right, if we could just persuade everyone to only eat insect protein for the world? You know, fundamentally, there are numerous reasons why people are pursuing meat alternatives. A lot of it's from a climate change and sustainability perspective, right? And the fact is, we're running out of time to have a big impact. And you know, I've always had a general ethos that it's kind of easier to change technology than change people, right? It's like, you know, if we could just persuade everyone to eat very little meat and have the only meat they eat be like, you know, from a small number of like carbon neutral, you know, grass-fed farms, whatever it is, then that's a solution, right? But can we persuade the entire world to do that in the next 5 years? Like, no chance, right? And I think it's similar with insects. Like, could you persuade everyone to stop eating steaks and just eat like insect protein? Like, not on any like reasonable time frame where it could have a big impact. But I do think that we need to do everything, right? There's no like one solution that's gonna shift people over. And so I think, you know, the work that Andrew and Julie, everyone is doing to just kind of like go at this from every direction is what we need to do.
So we're touching on improving the food system globally, and there's a criticism that that plant-based foods are more expensive, or alternative proteins more broadly are more expensive than the meat or the animal-based products. So this question is initially to you, Julie. How affordable do you think alternative non-animal based foods will be in the near term, and will poorer countries be able to afford these products?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing price points coming down compared to what we saw several years ago when a lot of these products launched into the market. And again, that just goes back to the basics of economics, supply efficiencies. So scale, being able to produce the ingredients that go into these products in the most cost efficient way and the most sustainable way. I think we're seeing those prices come down. They need to be equivalent to their alternatives, because you don't want that to be a barrier going forward. To your point, here in the US, maybe certain demographics, maybe there's not so much price sensitivity, but as we look to get this adopted throughout the United States, throughout the world, there's going to be pinch points around the cost. So I think, I think we're seeing those efficiencies as more companies come into providing ingredients and more companies start larger scale operations of plant-based products. Those parities are going to be reached. I do think there will be some limitations and maybe some different approaches. Sometimes we get into a situation what we call reverse innovation, where we take innovation from another country struggling with another facet of innovation and we bring it back to the US. And one of the things we see is the utilization of sort of the whole plant. The making sure that the fiber, the starch, the protein, it's a valorization effort to really bring all of the parts together, and that will help with the economics of these products. And so that's a very different approach as to what has been done over the last couple of years, which is more around concentrating proteins or looking for proteins that need to be isolated or concentrated, structured into meats. So I think, various principles and technologies will be adopted as we look to other countries, and we bring some of that back to the US, and we also take the innovation that we've done here, the supply chain efficiencies we've done here, and move that to other countries. And really, I think you're going to need both of those together. But, they say taste is king, but price is queen. So, They both have to fit together.
A couple of things that occur to me. One is, I think there's there was a data point I read recently that something like 80% of the crops that we grow are fed to animals over a 12-month, 18-month, whatever the time period might be of the life of a cow or the life of a pig or the life of a chicken. Much shorter for the chicken than the cow and the pig. So, we're growing all of these crops so that we can feed the animals, so that we can then eat the animals. It's actually much more efficient, and from both an input-output perspective, but also potentially longer term from a cost perspective, by skipping that kind of animal piece right in the middle there, by just going straight from the crop to the alternative protein. The other thing is, I'm not sure that the factory farming animal side of the equation and the cost that people talk about versus plant-based is actually truly reflective of the cost of the animal factory farming industry in terms of climate, sustainability, and some of the other costs. I don't think we factor all of the costs of that industry into the cost of the item that people are consuming in the supermarket. Example, many studies have suggested that the animal factory farming industry is tied for one or maybe a close second to transportation in terms of climate impact. So the costs, those sorts of costs, are not really being factored into the price of a steak that you buy in a typical supermarket. If we were factoring in climate impact and the other things into the meat industry, I'm guessing that the price of meat would be quite different than the price of plant-based alternatives.
Yeah, so I think we've got time for one quick question before we end, and that's going to be a question from me. So I believe that the Science History Institute Museum is going to have an exhibit on the history of food and food processing. And I'd like to quickly ask all three of you, starting with Julie, and then going to Josh and then to Andrew, what exhibit you would put in the museum to represent the alternative protein movement? So Julie.
No pressure. So if I were to put something in the museum that would be a bit of a show of where we are today, I think it would really it would be something that would educate. And I know I keep going back to education, but I really feel like that's a place where there's been just a huge gap in eating, in food production, and people just were never educated about where we were and where we've gone, and to Josh's point, where we're headed. And because this gap existed, whether it be on the planet, whether it be on greenhouse gas and energy and water usage and soil health and the things that we've been eating, where our food has come from, there's just been sort of, in my opinion, a bit of a big disservice around education for where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So if it were me, I would have a station that would describe this and show this a little bit clearer as to how much we rely on the animal side of our agriculture and to feed the planet, and how unrealistic that is going forward as the population grows and as the planet changes. And so I would want to show some sort of timeline or maybe exhibit that would take us through where we were, where we are today, and how far we really need to go to make this change, and really show the things that we can do actively, that individuals can contribute, make decisions, make better decisions, and start actually making a difference in this this kind of, where are we headed for the next 30 to 40 plus years.
Yeah, that's pretty great. So very inspirational. Mine feels a little bit kind of humdrum, but in comparison, I think I would want to kind of demystify cultured meat, right? And so I would want an exhibit showing the kind of process all the way from taking a small biopsy from a live animal, taking that through a seed train, growing it in a bioreactor, harvesting the cells and turning it into a final food product like a burger or whatever it is, or chicken nugget that people can eat, and just showing that process from end to end so that people get a sense for how these new foods are created.
So when I came to the US for the first time, I drove all the way down from New York to Florida via Atlanta and various other places. And I went to the CocaCola Museum in Atlanta. And I remember the last stage of that museum, the CocaCola Museum, where they ended up having every drink they could possibly serve around the world on a fountain. And you could go around with your cup and you could like have all of the different drinks and get really high on their kind of sugar soda. And I, as a 21-year-old, just went around and had everything. So from my point of view, this stand within the museum would be very much about the food. So it, for example, would have a whole range of different plant-based milks and foods to try. It would have plant-based as well as regular ice creams. It would have plant-based, cell-based, regular burgers, all side by side, so that people can taste and see that they're actually quite similar in terms of texture, taste, and so on. But it would be a cornucopia of flavors and smells, and the ability for consumers to try everything and see that the mental barriers they have for one kind versus another is actually really a self-created barrier. And a lot of these foods are amazing and need to be tasted.
I'm looking forward to these exhibits. So before we hand it back, are there any final thoughts? We probably have like negative 5 minutes, but any final thoughts?
I'll just jump in and say, following on from what Julie said, for the exhibit, that's something for all of you today, right? Everyone has in their power to make decisions about what you're eating and to start shifting your carbon impact as a result today. And so I hope that we've persuaded some of you to start thinking a little more deeply about that.
Agreed. The power's in their hands.
Yeah. And
I would say part of the power's in our hands, the people who are creating these products, who are stimulating, either from an ingredient perspective like Julie, or from a creative perspective like Josh or me, in terms of investing in great companies. It's our responsibility to deliver great foods to people who are making those daily decisions of whether or not they integrate it within their daily diets. So the onus is actually on us to make sure that the products are tasty, price competitive, and hit the cultural expectations that we all have around our food and how we interact with food as a people.
Thank you for watching this presentation. ACS Webinars is provided as a service by the American Chemical Society as your professional source for live weekly discussions and presentations that connect you with subject matter experts and global thought leaders concerning today's relevant professional issues in the chemical sciences, management, and business.